Detroit, in 1923, was a city like no other in America. The smell of oil and steel hung heavy in the air, rising from the chimneys of Henry Ford's empire. Day and night, the auto plants devoured men like coal shoveled into a furnace, spitting them back out broken, exhausted, or if they were lucky, enriched with a steady paycheck. The streets hummed with the chatter of immigrants, Poles, Hungarians, Italians, black families from the South, all drawn by the promise of $5 days. Jazz spilled from basement speakeasies, mingling with the rattle of streetcars and the clatter of horse carts still stubbornly rolling alongside the new motor cars. Detroit was a city of contrasts, machines and flesh, progress and ruin, hope and dread. And in the cracks between those opposites, Ernest Caldwell found his opportunity. The man in the gray suit. Caldwell was not born to Detroit. He arrived in the city in 1918 when the influenza epidemic was at its peak. He claimed he had once worked in Chicago, though no one could say in what capacity. Some whispered that he had fled debts there, others that he had left behind a wife and child. He never confirmed nor denied these stories. What mattered was that he arrived polished, articulate, and ready to sell. In the insurance trade, appearance was everything. Men trusted a fellow in a press suit more than they trusted the preacher who married them. Caldwell had 3 suits, one charcoal gray, one navy, one light tweed for summer, and he wore them as if they were armor. His shoes gleamed. His mustache was thin, trimmed like a line of ink on his face. Most insurance men of the time went door to door with pamphlets, droning about premiums and security. Caldwell did not. He invited prospects into his office on Woodward Avenue, where sunlight filtered through lace curtains onto polished oak furniture. He poured them coffee, sometimes even whiskey, if he sensed they were the sort to appreciate it. Then he listened, really listened to their fears. And he knew, better than any of his peers, that fear was the key to sales, a seed of an idea. The influenza had taught Americans one cruel lesson. Death was random. Whole households had been wiped out in a week. Fathers buried children, children buried mothers. And though the war had ended, veterans limped home with missing limbs, haunted eyes, and lungs scarred by gas. Mortality was not abstract. It was everywhere. Caldwell understood this atmosphere better than most. He saw that ordinary life insurance had begun to feel insufficient. People didn't just want compensation for their deaths. They wanted protection against them. The seed of his grand scheme was planted on a wet November afternoon in 1922, during a conversation with Thomas Laird, a machinist at Ford's Highland Park plant. Laird was a big man with rough hands and a suspicious gaze. He listened to Caldwell's pitch with a scowl. "Feels like you're betting on me dying," Laird grumbled. "Don't sit right with me, making money off that." Caldwell paused. He was used to objections. Too expensive, too complicated, too much paperwork. But this was different. And then, in a moment of inspiration, he leaned forward. "Not quite, Mr. Laird. Think of it instead as an arrangement with life itself. You sign, you pay, and in return, life has a reason to keep you here. You're invested in your own continuance." Laird chuckled uneasily. "You making deals with the Almighty now?" "Not at all," Caldwell replied smoothly. "Just with the odds. But sometimes, the odds need persuasion." By the end of the hour, Laird had signed, the miracle on the line. A month later, in December, a steel girder slipped from a crane in the Highland Park plant. It smashed through the floor, crushing tools, shattering wood. Men scattered like ants. By some quirk of timing, Thomas Laird had stepped away seconds before the girder fell exactly where he had been working. Bruised but unhurt, he returned home that night, shaken but alive. To his wife, he muttered that perhaps the insurance had done it. To his drinking buddies, he laughed that he had an agreement with fate. And by the end of that winter, men all across the plant were whispering about Laird's miracle, the transformation of a salesman. Caldwell was no fool. He understood opportunity when it knocked. He rebranded his pitch overnight. Where once he had spoken of death benefits, now he spoke of continuance. Where once he had sold protection for widows, now he sold protection for the living. The policies themselves were dressed in new language. No longer did they name beneficiaries upon death. Instead, They contained clauses about vitality sustained and rights of extension. Caldwell even paid a calligrapher to add flourishes and faint Latin phrases in the margins, phrases no one could quite translate. He was careful, of course. He never outright claimed immortality. He only suggested, hinted, implied, but implication was more powerful than promise. Clients filled in the blanks themselves. And the strangest thing happened. Those who believed lived differently. The first followers. By spring of 1923, Caldwell had more than 50 clients. They were not the wealthy elite, at least, not yet. They were dock workers, school teachers, widows, foremen. They were people who had suffered and who wanted desperately not to suffer again. One of his earliest clients, Harold Green, a frail teacher with chronic bronchitis, swore he hadn't been sick once since buying his policy. He credited Caldwell's paper with his newfound vigor. Another, Mary Talbot, insisted that her husband's tuberculosis had slowed since she signed him up. He lingered for months longer than the doctors predicted, long enough to walk his daughter down the aisle. These stories spread faster than any advertisement. Soon Caldwell's name was whispered in factory break rooms and over church pews. People came not just for insurance, but for reassurance, for a taste of hope they couldn't find anywhere else. The illusion of control. Caldwell understood the psychology of belief better than any scientist. If a man thought himself protected, he lived more carefully, ate more modestly, sought treatment earlier. If a woman believed her husband was bound to life, she nursed him with fresh determination, and sometimes that determination alone stretched his days. It was not magic, but it felt like magic. And in a world still trembling from war and plague, magic was precisely what Detroit craved. Clara Whitcomb takes note. Not everyone was charmed. Clara Whitcomb, a young journalist at the Detroit Free Press, heard whispers of immortality insurance in early summer. She was the sort who noticed oddities. The price of bread, the shifting hours at the factory, the way people lowered their voices when Caldwell's name was spoken. At first she dismissed it as rumor, but when she interviewed a widow for an unrelated story, and the woman produced one of Caldwell's ornate contracts to guarantee the continuance of vitality, Clara felt the hairs on her arms rise. What was this man selling? And why were people buying? Caldwell's growing power. By midsummer 1923, Caldwell had moved offices to a larger suite on Woodward Avenue. He hired a secretary, a timid girl named June, who typed neatly and asked few questions. He purchased a motor car, a second-hand Packard, that gleamed outside his office like a badge of success. And he began to attract wealthier clients, a factory supervisor, a small-time politician, a banker's mistress. They came to him in secret, ashamed perhaps of how much they wanted to believe. The more they believed, the more his legend grew. A dangerous game. But with power came danger. Caldwell knew he was walking a razor's edge. If even one client died too soon, if even one family demanded repayment, the illusion could collapse. He soothed himself with rationalizations. His contracts never promised literal immortality, only protection, extension, continuance. He had written them carefully, legally, and yet deep inside, a tremor of fear remained, because he had begun to wonder, what if it was real? Chapter 2. The Followers. Stories of those who believed. The success of Ernest Caldwell's scheme did not come from one miraculous escape, nor from clever wording on his policies. It came from the people who believed. Ordinary men and women who turned a salesman's promise into a lifeline. Detroit in 1923 was a city built on stories. Factory workers told stories of the line, of men losing fingers to machines and walking away as if nothing had happened. Mothers told stories of sickness narrowly survived, of children spared when others perished. Preachers spoke of divine protection, while union organizers whispered of strength in numbers. Into this chorus of tales entered a new kind of story, the story of the policy that made death hesitate. Harold Green, the teacher who wouldn't cough. Harold Green was 36. And already looked 20 years older, a school teacher in a Polish neighborhood. He lived in a rented room above a bakery, his lungs rattling with every winter frost. Students whispered that he coughed up blood into his handkerchief when he turned to the chalkboard. He was one of Caldwell's first true converts, After signing his policy in March, Green became convinced that something had shifted. He no longer wheezed climbing stairs. The cough subsided. By June, he claimed he could shout lessons without strain. When a colleague suggested perhaps the change came from warmer weather or rest, Green shook his head fiercely. No, it's the policy. It keeps me upright. I've seen too many fall around me. Neighbors, my own brother. And yet here I stand. That man Caldwell gave me time. Students noticed his energy returning. Parents whispered that the strange insurance was working. One even came to Caldwell's office clutching crumpled dollars, begging for a contract of her own. Mary Talbot, the widow who bargained with time. Mary Talbot's husband had been given 6 months to live. Tuberculosis had eaten his lungs. Doctors spoke of sanatoriums and slow decline. Mary, desperate, came to Caldwell in April. Caldwell, with his calm gaze and soft voice, placed a contract before her. "This is not a promise of eternity," he told her, "but it is a contract of continuance. Sometimes all a man needs is a reason to hold on." Mary signed, paying out of her meager savings. Her husband lingered, not 6 months, but 15. He lived long enough to see his daughter married in August 1924, long enough to cradle his first grandchild before the end. Mary told anyone who would listen that Caldwell had saved her family. When her husband finally passed, she did not feel cheated. "The Lord and Mr. Caldwell gave me years I was not owed," she declared at the funeral. And that is a miracle. Her testimony spread like gospel among her neighbors.
Elijah and Ruth Carter, the factory couple.
Elijah Carter worked the night shift at a Dodge Brothers plant. His wife Ruth cleaning offices downtown. Together they scraped by, always fearing that an accident or illness would leave one of them destitute. When they heard of Caldwell's policies, they were skeptical. But Ruth, who carried a small wooden cross in her apron pocket, said quietly, "Maybe the Lord works through men like him." They signed a joint contract, rare in Caldwell's books, paying what little they had. That summer, Elijah narrowly avoided a belt snap on the line that killed another worker. Weeks later, Ruth was struck by a streetcar, but emerged with nothing worse than a broken arm. To them, these were not coincidences. They were proof. Soon, the Carters became evangelists for Caldwell. At church socials, they whispered about the man on Woodward Avenue who sold time itself. Their congregation began to trickle into his office. The growing circle. By midsummer, Caldwell's clients had begun to recognize one another. A widow at market would nod to a schoolteacher. A factory man would raise a glass to a woman whose husband still lived. They spoke of themselves not merely as policyholders, but as the protected. Some even formed small gatherings, coffee circles, prayer groups, where they shared stories of narrow escapes and renewed strength. Caldwell never attended these meetings, but he knew of them. His secretary, June, overheard whispers, brought back notes. He smiled to himself. This was no longer insurance. It was a movement. Clara Whitcomb's notes. Meanwhile, journalist Clara Whitcomb filled notebooks with testimonies. She tracked Green's improved health, Mary Talbot's extended miracle, the Carters' escapes. She noted dates, places, witnesses, but she also noted the gaps, the lack of hard medical evidence, the way coincidences were twisted into certainty, the silence about failures. She wrote in her journal one July evening, "Caldwell's genius is not in cheating death, but in teaching people to see survival as proof. He sells them their own luck, packaged as a policy, and they adore him for it." Still, she wondered, how long could the illusion last? Caldwell himself. For Caldwell, the summer of 1923 was intoxicating. His office bustled, his income soared, his reputation grew. He dined at better restaurants, sat in better company, and even began to toy with politics, donating discreetly to a city councilman, attending fundraisers where he charmed bankers and lawyers. Yet he remained cautious. He never declared immortality outright, never left a paper trail too explicit. His contracts were carefully worded, his promises veiled, but at night, alone in his office, he sometimes stared at the remaining stack of blank policies and felt a chill. For what if, somehow, they were real? The first rumblings of doubt. Not all stories ended well. A dock worker named Samuel Ortiz, one of Caldwell's early clients, drowned in the river after a bar fight. His body was pulled ashore, his policy found folded in his jacket. His widow demanded answers. Caldwell soothed her. Speaking of contracts broken, rights unfulfilled, the danger of mixing alcohol with promises of life. But word of Ortiz's death spread. Some began to murmur. Still, for every doubt, there were 10 stories of survival, of extension, of uncanny fortune. The balance of belief remained in Caldwell's favor. The summer heat. Detroit's summer of 1923 was sweltering, the air heavy with smoke from factories and dust from construction. Tempers flared, strikes loomed, prohibition raids swept speakeasies. Yet in the midst of it, the story of the man who sold life endured. Caldwell was compared to a doctor, a priest, even a magician. One paper mentioned him in passing as a psychological salesman, though most ignored the whispers. But Clara Whitcomb did not ignore them. She sharpened her pen, waiting for the moment when the story would turn. And that moment was coming. Chapter 3. The Doubters. Investigation and Suspicion. By the end of summer 1923, Ernest Caldwell had become a man of quiet legend. His name passed between lips in barber shops, factory lunchrooms, and church pews. Some swore he was blessed. Others muttered that he was a fraud. Belief made him powerful, but doubt was inevitable. And doubt had a way of spreading faster than faith. Clara Whitcomb sharpens her pen. Clara Whitcomb was 28, with the sharp eyes of a woman who missed nothing. She had fought her way into the newsroom of the Detroit Free Press, when most editors still thought women belonged in the society pages. She covered strikes, prohibition raids, and political scandals, often outpacing her male colleagues. When she first heard whispers of Caldwell's continuance policies, she thought it another harmless quirk of a restless city. But as summer wore on, she noticed a pattern. Letters to the editor mentioned him. Families cited him in interviews. His name crept into conversations like smoke seeping under a door. Yet she began keeping a file. Testimonials clipped from church bulletins, overheard remarks jotted down, copies of his ornate contracts smuggled by curious clients. The contracts fascinated her, especially the language, vitality sustained, rights of extension, not the language of law but of ritual, insurance written like scripture, she mused one evening to her editor. Her editor shrugged. So, people buy stranger things every day. But he isn't selling snake oil, Clara countered. He's selling hope itself. If it fails, he'll ruin people. Her editor tapped his cigarette ash into a tray. Write it when you have proof, Whitcomb. Until then, it's rumor. Proof was what she needed, and proof was hard to find. Rivals in the industry, Caldwell's rise, did not go unnoticed by other insurance men. Detroit in the 1920s was crowded with agents hustling for a dollar. Most played fair, selling policies door to door with little glamour. Caldwell, with his oak-furnished office and mysterious aura, infuriated them. At luncheons of the Detroit Life Underwriters Association, his name was spat like a curse. He's giving us all a bad name, growled one agent, promising people eternal life. You think that helps when we're trying to sell legitimate coverage? Another shook his head. Clients come to me quoting him, asking why I can't guarantee they'll never die. It's madness. The rivals filed complaints with the state insurance commissioner. Letters accused Caldwell of unethical practices, of false advertising, of defrauding the desperate. But without direct promises in writing, without hard evidence of deceit, the commissioner's office stalled. Caldwell's contracts, deliberately vague, danced just inside the law. Still, the pressure was building. The case of Joseph Kane. The first true blow came in September. Joseph Kane, a 52-year-old line supervisor at Packard, had purchased one of Caldwell's ornate policies in May. By all accounts, he became a devout believer, carrying the contract folded in his breast pocket, showing it to coworkers as if it were a charm. On a sweltering afternoon, Kane collapsed on the line. His heart gave out before the ambulance arrived. When his widow brought the body home, neighbors whispered, "But didn't he have Caldwell's policy?" The widow, distraught, stormed into Caldwell's office days later, the contract in her trembling hands. "You promised he wouldn't die," she sobbed. Caldwell remained composed, folding his hands on the desk. "Mrs. Kane, the policy never said your husband was immortal. It spoke of vitality extended, of protection so long as one lives in accordance. Some men break the terms without realizing." "What terms?" she cried. "He did nothing wrong." "I cannot speak for his choices," Caldwell said smoothly, "but perhaps overwork, poor diet, strain. These things can erode vitality, even against the strongest of contracts." The widow left in rage, tearing the paper to pieces in the street. Word spread quickly. At factory gates, men whispered that Caldwell had failed. Doubt began to gnaw at belief. Clara's interview. Clara Whitcomb saw her chance. She tracked down Mrs. Kane and persuaded her to speak on record. "Did he ever tell you Caldwell guaranteed him life?" Clara asked. Mrs. Kane's eyes blazed. "Yes, my Joseph believed it with all his heart. He thought he was protected. He thought nothing could touch him. And now he lies in Elmwood Cemetery." Clara pressed further. "Do you think Caldwell deceived him?" "I think," the widow spat, "that Caldwell is a devil in a gray suit." It was exactly the quote Clara needed. Caldwell confronted. Days later, Clara herself walked into Caldwell's office, notebook ready. He greeted her politely, poured coffee, and spoke in his usual calm tones. But when she laid down her evidence, Mrs. Kane's words, a list of other complaints, notes from rival agents, his eyes narrowed. "You're building a case," he said quietly. "I'm building the truth," Clara replied. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "If you print this, you'll be remembered as the woman who told Detroit it was mortal again. Is that the legacy you want? To rip away hope from the grieving?" Clara's pen hovered above her notebook. She saw, perhaps for the first time, the true danger of Caldwell. Not his policies, but his rhetoric. He knew exactly how to twist guilt, to make doubt feel like cruelty. But Clara only said, "The truth isn't cruel, Mr. Caldwell. Lies are." She left with his calm smile following her out the door. The gathering storm. The Kane scandal sparked investigations. The insurance commissioner dispatched clerks to examine Caldwell's contracts. Rivals pressured local newspapers to denounce him. Ministers began warning their flocks against false promises dressed as paper. Yet still, his followers clung to him. At coffee circles and church basements, they whispered that Joseph Kane must have broken the covenant, drunk too much, eaten poorly, lived unwisely. They told themselves Caldwell's policies still worked, so long as one honored them. Belief, even battered, was hard to kill. Caldwell's private thoughts. Alone at night, Caldwell felt the walls closing in. The Kane death shook him deeply. For the first time, a client's passing could not be dismissed as coincidence. He poured whiskey, stared at his reflection, and muttered, "What if I've gone too far?" Yet the next morning, in his pressed gray suit, he walked into the office as serene as ever. Clients never saw his doubt. To them, he was still the man who could outwit death. Clara's first draft. By October, Clara had assembled enough material for a full exposé. Her draft ran 10 pages, outlining testimonies, rival complaints, and the Kane case. She titled it, "The Immortality Fraud: How One Insurance Agent Preys on Detroit's Fears." Her editor read it, frowned, and said, "Strong work, but dangerous. He hasn't broken any laws yet. We could be sued." Clara's jaw tightened. "So we wait until more people die?" The editor sighed. "No, we wait until we can prove intent. Until then, keep digging." Clara returned to her notebook, frustrated but undeterred. She knew the storm was only beginning. The fire on Woodward. On October 11th, 1923, flames lit the night sky above Caldwell's office. Neighbors rushed with buckets, but the fire roared too fast. By dawn, the oak furniture, the lace curtains, the files, the ornate contracts, all had turned to ash. Caldwell claimed it was an accident, faulty wiring, perhaps, but whispers said otherwise. Rivals insisted he torched it himself to destroy evidence. Followers murmured that enemies had tried to silence him. Whatever the truth, the fire erased records that might have damned him. The commissioner's clerks found nothing left to examine. And Caldwell, standing amid the smoking ruins, merely adjusted his cufflinks and said softly, "The fire does not end the covenant. Paper burns, promises endure." His followers believed, his doubters grew louder, and Detroit itself began to hold its breath. Chapter 4. The Exposure. A City Learns the Truth. By the winter of 1923, the glamour around Ernest Caldwell had begun to tarnish. Rumors circulated in taverns, churches, and union halls. Stories of policies that had failed, of men and women who died despite their signatures and their faith. The whispers were quiet at first, drowned by the louder testimonies of survival. But Clara Whitcomb listened to both. She had spent months gathering evidence, notebooks brimming with interviews and contradictions. Now she prepared to strike the printing press. On January 7th, 1924, the Detroit Free Press carried a front-page feature with the headline, "Policies Against Death: The Strange Business of Ernest Caldwell." The article did not accuse him outright of fraud. It merely presented facts, testimonies, inconsistencies. It printed Clara's interviews with widows who felt cheated, doctors who scoffed, and factory overseers who spoke of accidents that no contract could have prevented. But the piece also quoted his loyalists, men and women who swore Caldwell had saved them. The effect was electric. Detroit split almost overnight between those who saw him as a savior and those who branded him a charlatan. Caldwell's response. Caldwell reacted with the calm of a practiced showman. Standing at the front of his office, he addressed the crowd that had gathered in defense of him. "They print words because they cannot print miracles," he said, holding a policy aloft. "Do you not feel it in your lungs, in your bones? You are the proof, not their ink." The crowd roared. For a moment, belief triumphed over skepticism. But behind closed doors, Caldwell felt a tremor of fear. For the first time, the city's gaze had turned toward him, not with awe, but with suspicion. The committee. Within weeks, the city council formed a special committee to investigate. Banks began to hesitate in cashing Caldwell's deposits. Businessmen, who once courted him, now kept their distance. Clara Whitcomb was summoned as a key witness. In a crowded chamber, she laid her notebooks on the table and read aloud. "Mr. Caldwell's contracts contain no measurable promise, no actuarial science. They are faith masquerading as finance. He has sold not policies, but illusions." Caldwell, seated across the room, watched her with a faint smile, as though the spectacle amused him. When it was his turn to speak, he rose, adjusted his cuffs, and declared, "Is it fraud to give hope? Is it deceit to remind people that death is not master of every hour? I did not cheat these men and women. They stand before you healthier, stronger, braver because of what I offered. If you call that a crime, then write the charge plainly. Ernest Caldwell is guilty of making people believe in life." Applause broke out among his supporters. The committee adjourned without decision, the turning point. But faith could not forever shield him. In February, two tragedies struck in quick succession. Harold Green, the teacher who had once regained his voice, collapsed at his desk, dead from a hemorrhage. And Elijah Carter, the factory worker whose wife had clutched a joint policy, was killed in a machinery accident. Their deaths sent shockwaves through Caldwell's circle. For the first time, the protected began to doubt aloud. Ruth Carter confronted Caldwell directly, her arm trembling as she held her husband's tattered policy. "You said we would be spared," she whispered. Caldwell, cornered, spoke softly. "I never said forever. I only gave you more." But the words rang hollow. Clara's final blow. On March 3rd, Clara published her most damning piece, Immortality for Sale: The Caldwell Illusion. She revealed not only the testimonies of the dead's families, but also Caldwell's financial records, extravagant dinners, political donations, secret accounts. She painted him not as a mystic, but as a manipulator, a man who dressed fraud in poetry. This time, the city turned. Clients flooded his office, demanding refunds. Policemen arrived with warrants. Caldwell was indicted on charges of fraud, false representation, and unlawful solicitation of insurance without state license. The arrest. The morning of March 10th. Snow falling over Detroit. Ernest Caldwell was led out of his office in handcuffs. His face remained serene, but his eyes flickered as he saw the crowd gathered outside, some jeering, others weeping. many silent. Clara watched from across the street, notebook in hand. She expected triumph, but instead felt only a weary sorrow. For in Caldwell's downfall, she saw not only the ruin of a fraudster, but the collapse of hundreds of fragile hopes. The trial, Caldwell's trial that summer, drew national attention. Witnesses recounted tales of salvation and betrayal alike. Doctors testified, economists explained, clergy debated. Caldwell himself took the stand, delivering eloquent defenses that blurred the line between philosophy and confession. "I never claimed to conquer death," he told the jury. "I only claimed that belief could delay it. And did it not? Count the months, the years my clients lived beyond their expected time. If faith is medicine, then I merely sold the prescription." It was a brilliant performance, but it could not erase the evidence of his profits, the deaths of his clients, the manipulation of their fears. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence: Caldwell was sentenced to 10 years in Jackson State Prison. As the gavel fell, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Relief, anger, grief. Clara closed her notebook for the last time. She had uncovered the truth, but victory tasted bitter. For Detroit had lost not only its strange profit, but also the fragile hope he had sold. Epilogue of the chapter. As Caldwell was escorted away, one of his last clients shouted from the gallery, "You gave us more life than we had, Ernest. We'll never forget." Caldwell paused, turned his head slightly, and smiled before disappearing through the door. Outside, the city exhaled. Detroit was done with immortality for now. Chapter 5. The Aftermath. What remained of Caldwell's legacy? The trial of Ernest Caldwell ended with a clang of iron doors, but the echoes carried far beyond the prison walls. His name became a parlor joke in some circles, a curse in others, and in a few, a whispered blessing. For though the man was gone, the idea he had planted refused to die. Detroit in mourning. Detroit in the summer of 1924 did not laugh easily. The auto boom continued, but strikes loomed, wages stalled, and prohibition raids kept the nights uneasy. Caldwell's downfall left a vacuum in the city's strange folklore. For many, his exposure confirmed what they had always suspected, that hope was a con, that faith was a trap for the gullible. Newspapers ran satirical cartoons of Caldwell selling insurance against rain or policies against Tuesday. Bank clerks and bartenders used his name as shorthand for folly. But in the neighborhoods where his clients had lived and loved, the tone was different. There, people spoke of the months or years Caldwell had given them. They spoke not with shame, but with gratitude, as though his fraud had somehow been true enough to matter. The survivors' circle, Mary Talbot, whose husband had lived longer than any doctor predicted, continued to host small gatherings in her home. Widows, widowers, and former clients came together not to curse Caldwell, but to remember. "We all knew deep down," Mary said one evening, pouring tea for her guests, "but he gave us something to hold on to. And sometimes, that's all a soul needs." Her words became a refrain among the circle. They did not defend Caldwell's greed, but they did not despise him either. To them, he was not a fraudster alone. He was a vessel, flawed and human, through which their hope had briefly burned brighter. Clara Whitcomb's reflection. For Clara, the months after the trial were filled with recognition. Her articles were syndicated, her name respected in journalistic circles. She was offered posts in Chicago, New York, even Washington, but the victory left her uneasy. She had set out to reveal a fraud, and she had succeeded. Yet the more distance she gained from the case, the more she wondered if she had misunderstood something essential. In her private journal, she confessed, "Caldwell deceived. Yes, he took money for words, but I cannot shake the look in his client's eyes, the light, the certainty. Did I strip them of lies, or of the very rope that kept them from drowning? Perhaps both." She kept writing, but never again pursued a story with the same hunger. Caldwell in prison. Ernest Caldwell began his sentence at Jackson State Prison with the calm dignity of a man entering a lecture hall. Fellow inmates soon learned of his reputation. Some mocked him. Others sought him out, pressing for secrets of immortality. Caldwell obliged with stories, parables, lessons. He became a kind of chaplain without a pulpit, a counselor without ordination. Guards remarked that men left his cell steadier than they entered. He wrote constantly, letters, treatises, reflections. Some were intercepted and published in newspapers. In one, he declared, "They called it fraud, but it was theater. If a man believes he will live, and thus he lives longer, is the play not worth the price of admission?" His writings earned him both admirers and enemies. The warden grew weary of reporters requesting interviews. The spread of the legend. By 1925, the legend of Caldwell had spread beyond Detroit. Traveling salesmen told embellished tales of the man who sold life. Preachers warned congregations against false prophets, invoking his name alongside biblical deceivers. But in taverns and factory break rooms, his story took on a different flavor. Men joked about buying Caldwell coverage before risky jobs, or claimed they still had policies tucked away, protecting them in secret. The more time passed, the less Caldwell seemed like a criminal, and the more he resembled a folk figure, half conman, half saint. Ruth Carter's Testament. In 1927, Ruth Carter, widow of Elijah, one of Caldwell's most loyal clients, published a slim pamphlet with the help of her church. It was titled, "A Few More Years, My Life with Ernest Caldwell's Promise." The pamphlet did not defend Caldwell's money or his lies. Instead, it told the story of how she and Elijah had lived more joyfully under the belief that death could be delayed. "He was wrong," she wrote, "but he gave us courage, and courage is its own kind of immortality." The pamphlet circulated quietly, passed hand to hand, read in kitchens and factory yards. It ensured that Caldwell's legacy remained more complicated than any verdict could declare. Caldwell's final days. Caldwell served 7 of his 10 years before being released for good behavior in 1931. By then, Detroit had changed. The Great Depression was taking hold. Bread lines lengthened. Factories faltered. No longer a flamboyant figure, Caldwell lived quietly in a boarding house, offering small lectures on psychological resilience to anyone who would listen. He no longer spoke of policies, but of belief, of endurance, of the strange power of conviction. He died in 1934 of pneumonia, a modest obituary tucked on page 7 of the Free Press. It described him as a salesman of unusual talents, whose career ended in controversy. But among those who remembered him, the obituary seemed almost an insult, for to them, Caldwell had been more than a headline. He had been a chapter in their lives. Clara's epilogue, Clara Whitcomb, by then an established writer, clipped the obituary and placed it in her scrapbook. She stared at it for a long time, then wrote a final note beneath. He gave them time, or the illusion of time. Perhaps there is no difference. Perhaps that is the lesson. What remained? By the late 1930s, Caldwell's name had faded from public memory, swallowed by greater crises, the Depression, the rise of organized crime, the coming of war. Yet his story lingered in quiet corners, in family anecdotes, in whispered prayers, in the joke of a foreman who told workers they were immortal if they had a Caldwell policy. And so, though his fraud was exposed, though his prison term was real, Ernest Caldwell achieved a strange kind of victory. He did not conquer death, but he did what so few men have ever done. He convinced a city, for a brief and brilliant time, that death could be bargained with. In that sense, Detroit's immortality fraud was not merely a crime, it was a mirror, reflecting the desperate, enduring human wish to believe that we might live just a little longer. Closing lines. The story of Ernest Caldwell ends not in scandal or salvation, but in the silence of memory. He was a man who sold what could not be sold, and yet in the selling made it real enough to change lives. Perhaps immortality is not in the body, nor in the contract, but in the story that outlives us, and by that measure, the insurance agent who sold policies to people who never died has, in a way, never died himself.